Welcome to Forward Ever, Leading in Challenging Times, presented by Worth Wealth Management, a weekly conversation with area leaders about how to persevere during uncertain times. Now here's your host, Gary Shorman.
Hi, and welcome to our program. We have a guest, one of those that important job coming up here in the next few weeks. Kansas Secretary of State Scott Schwab is our guest. And I say important in the next few weeks, that's because of election. But I get to see your name on all sorts of documents as Secretary of State. Scott, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you. Thanks for having us. Appreciate it. And it's always good to talk to those folks, as we say, out west.
Yeah, sometimes we hold our own out here. Sometimes we don't, but we do our best. So, Scott, I know you have been through what was a very active primary election part of that. How are you doing getting ready for the big election coming up here in a few weeks?
You know, it's actually going almost eerily smooth. Going into that primary with a lot of the innuendo and rumors and attacks on the integrity of our system, and then essentially proving all those wrong with the recounts, not changing anything. Our phones are quieter than usual. And it seems like every time somebody saw something that didn't look quite right, they would call and accuse it of fraud. Well, now folks understand sometimes there might be an administrative error or somebody might not handle something the best way, because nobody goes to college and majors in elections. But at the end of the day, we get elections right. And people, I think, are being a little bit more gracious now that they know the result from the primary is we have a very secure election system in Kansas.
We'll talk about what makes it more secure.
Well, it's a
Kansas seems to
handful
be one of the best at doing this.
I agree. And, we got criticized for years for things like voter ID, and they accused us that it was going to be voter suppression. Well, we had record turnout in this primary. So clearly that's not true any more than it's true that we have widespread systemic voter fraud. And we've also had voter ID for advanced mail ballots. And a lot of states did not do such things. They just rely on signature matching. And we were able to rein that in. We were able to essentially come up with the concept that, most everybody who votes also has a driver's license, and we can accommodate the very few who do not. And because of that, those advanced mail ballots give us a real secure way to make sure the folks who are voting are actually the ones casting the ballot.
When you go to the ballot box, whether it be in the early voting or actually there, you want to know your vote counts, but
Right.
you also want to know it's fair. And I think that goes back to the start of our country.
Yes.
We want it to be fair. That's one of the reasons we are who we are, and who we are as we are in the state of Kansas. But talk about, you went through COVID, and this program talks about leadership during challenging times. That was a whole challenge, but then it turned into even more. How has that transition taken place through the state of Kansas?
Out of every tragedy and out of every challenge, there's good things that come up as a result. When COVID hit, we got sworn in 2019. And suddenly in 2020, it's our first presidential election. So obviously, for me especially, there's a little bit of a learning curve. But then you throw in there a pandemic, and then the governor asking me to cancel in-person voting, which obviously we didn't need to do. If folks can go to a liquor store and buy scotch, they can go vote. But the biggest concern we had, because a lot of our poll workers were an aging population, and we wanted to be careful of exposure there. And so if they weren't going to be poll workers, who's going to work the polls? And we really pushed, even before the pandemic, our governmental affairs person at the time, Katie Kapal, came up with the idea of a program called Student Serve. And you could be as young as 16 and work the polls. And so we really started pushing through our high schools and our public school system. Hey, let's get these 16, 17, and 18-year-olds working the polls. And a lot of parents brought their teenagers, or grandparents brought their teenagers to work the polls. And we do use a lot of technology to help us with security at our polling places. And a lot of these teenagers, it's intuitive to them. They've grown up in the digital age. So it just made things go smoother. And through that recruiting process, we had a lot of counties turn people away because they were over recruited. Douglas County turned away over 400. We were in Leavenworth County just a week ago, I think it was. It may have been 2 weeks. It's been a busy time. But the assistant clerk there told me, please do not recruit any more poll workers here. We're turning people away, and we hate to have to do that. But they do have a strong list now of applications in case, there is turnover in that poll worker system. Most people, when they volunteer at the polls on election day or in an early in-person voting, they end up loving it. And so they'll tell their friends to do it, or especially teenagers will bring a friend with them. And it just becomes a great experience. And so, yeah, it was really difficult during the pandemic. There were concerns of PPE and safety and bringing the public into public buildings. But what ended up happening is we have a lot more people engaged in the election space.
Well, congratulations for your leadership during that and getting
Thank
us
you.
to where we are today. Do you have, you mentioned technology. Do you have some people on your team that are, I'll say, wish we could all go back to paper and be done with it? Just do
Not
paper
on
and
our
that's it.
team. You know, it's really interesting because the folks that claim fraud through machines, really, if you want to compromise security in elections, get rid of the machines. Because if it's just paper, for example, a lot of people will not vote on the judges because they don't know how to vote on the judges. So they're going to vote for, US Senate, governor on down, Congress and whatnot. They're going to get to the judges. They're like, I'm just done. And they're going to cast their ballot. Well, if it's an electronic machine that's printed, if somebody comes by later when they're checking ballots and pulls out a pen and tries to finish that ballot, guess what? They're going to know that they're not going to count that because it's not going to match the burned in X that the printer does. However, if all we do is use a pen and paper, it only takes one poll worker to finish somebody else's ballot. And that's what they used to do in Chicago years ago when they had so much fraud in Illinois. And the other thing is when only humans are counting, there can be a mistake. But it's like I tell my mom, do you trust your math or do you trust your math and using the calculator along with it? Sometimes computers are non-emotional, so they're just binary. And so that's why it increases security simply because it limits the human element.
Scott, there's a couple of items that are on the ballot that are kind of interesting changes, and there's not a lot of publicity about that. Would you talk about those items? One, it involves the legislature and the power to overturn some administrative process. So there's a couple of big issues that are out there on the ballot.
Yeah, so this is really fascinating. When I was in the legislature, this was an issue I always tried to tackle, but I could never get traction. And once I leave, it happens. So I'm not sure what that says about me, but it's a difficult dynamic for the legislature. You've got to give some agility to the administration to carry out the law. And so the Supreme Court said rules and regs have the full force and effect of law. So when the legislature makes a policy, for example, when they do voter ID, they gave the Secretary of State rules and regulatory authority to carry that out. So you're not having to completely dictate in statute. And it gives us some agility like, hey, technology changes. We need to change the way we do this without passing a bill. The problem is sometimes you get an administration that uses that rule and reg authority to actually make policy. It happens a lot in ag. It happens a lot often in environmental policy, where they'll say, "Hey, these waterways, you can't dam up the water." Well, that wasn't the legislature's policy. That's your policy, and you're not a policymaker. You're a policy executor. And so, the only way for the legislature to fix that is to pass a law. Well, what's the governor going to do? They're going to veto that law, because it's undoing the very reg that the governor wants, and it gives too much weight to the governor. So what this would do is allow the legislature to bring back that authority to the legislature so they're making policy. The other way it makes equality is if I have a rule and reg and the legislature doesn't like it, they can pass a law. I don't get to veto it. I don't have veto power. The governor has the veto power, and she can sign something, but if they go after her rules and regs, she can veto it. So we're unequal in our branches of government, and this kind of reins that in.
So what's the vote on that when you go and you see it on your ballot? You vote yes for legislative
Yes is for
override?
the change. Yes gives the legislature the override on the rules and regs, and no keeps the status quo.
And there's another item that deals with the election of sheriffs. What's that about?
Yeah, so Johnson County had a brief conversation about making their sheriff an appointed and hired position. And it used to be in the Constitution of Kansas that the sheriff would be always elected. That was removed because Riley County basically joined their police force between the county and Manhattan into one police force, and they wanted that appointed and hired. Well, when they talked about making the Johnson County one hired, a lot of sheriffs said, whoa, we don't want to go down this road. This was only supposed to be for Riley County because they had a unified government. So therefore, the Sheriff's Association said, let's make sure these people stay elected, because you don't want a situation where You have a sheriff that's appointed, but also pulls over a county commissioner for a DUI. Now you got a conflict of interest. Whereas if that sheriff is elected, it eliminates that conflict.
Well, those are both ballots that make a difference in the state. So if somebody's out there going, one, you explained it very well, but
Oh,
people
thank
may
you.
want to do some research. Any other items on the ballot that people should be heads up on before they head in and go, I wish I would have thought about that a little bit.
Yeah, the biggest
I've
one
been
is the
there,
judge.
so.
I know, and I get all the time. Folks ask me, well, what am I supposed to do with this list of judges? And I always used to always joke, I wish, I didn't have to run for reelection. I could just run for retention. Should Scott Schwab be retained and not have to go against an opponent? But judges are to be retained. This is just me personally. I just vote no. Just being in the legislature, I have a lot of frustrations with a lot of our jurists. However, I recommend folks, if you have a friend who's an attorney, attorneys have a really good read on the judges. Now, they're not going to bash a judge because they're not going to compromise their law license, but they can give you a grade and say, you know what, this judge has always been fair. I don't always agree with his ruling, but he's a good jurist. And there's going to be other ones that say, this person, they have a tendency to misread and get a little more personal in court. And the attorney will just flat out tell you, I probably am not going to vote for these judges to be retained. I always rely on attorneys that I rely on for other matters on these judges because they have more interaction with them than I do.
Scott, that's a great idea because most of us don't have that interaction with the judges.
Yeah,
unless it's something really weird that gets reported.
Yeah, unless you're in litigation, in a civil litigation, or you're, being criminally prosecuted, or you're a victim or a victim family, you really don't have much interaction with the judicial branch.
So you mentioned it's kind of quiet going into this election. I want to talk a little bit more about what the Secretary of State's office does, because I think some people misunderstand how broad and how important the office is. But before we go there, the election coming up, you have a chance to go vote early if you want to. What should you prepare as you go into the ballot or go into the voting booth to be able to do that? What do you need when you go to there?
Well, if you have a grassroots organization that they have a grade card or where they endorsement list that you trust, whether it's a chamber or whether it's a union or whether it's KFL or whatever your organization is, you can bring those in. You can text people while you're in line, say, hey, who do I vote for here? All that stuff is fine to do in Kansas. We want educated voters. The biggest thing is have a plan. You only got one ballot, and once it's cast, it's cast. And we recommend folks, if you're doing an advanced mail ballot, either drop it off at any early advanced voting place, drop it off at any polling place in your county, or drop it off at a drop box in the county. Don't mail it if you can avoid it, because the post office is such a cluster right now. There's no guarantee that ballot is going to show up. So we always tell folks, treat your ballot like cash. Don't just throw it in an envelope and stick it in the post office and hope it arrives. Actually make sure you're the one who's handing it to either in a box, so that goes within the chain of custody by Kansans, or just take it to a polling place. Or the best thing to do is vote in person, whether on election day or early, if that's what you like to do. And when you put your ballot in that box, it's been cast, and that's the most secure way to make sure your ballot counted.
And you have a website you can go to get more information, correct?
Yeah, it's sos.ks.gov. That's sos.ks.gov. And by all means, or you can click on the election tab. If you look in the election tab, there's a lot of tools to help voters. There's also a tab if you do think you're seeing something, whether it's voter suppression or you think somebody's cheating, you can go ahead through that portal, let us know, and we'll investigate those. You can also check if you do have an advanced mail ballot, have they received your application? Have they mailed your ballot? Have they received your ballot? If it's getting to be about November 3rd or 4th and you go there and they haven't received your ballot, you might want to reach out and ask them to give you another one so that you can vote.
Like everything, there's so many ways to vote to make your vote count.
Yes.
But when you do that, just make sure the process is complete, because if you don't get it done, you don't click the final boxes, you don't get it in the mail in time, all those things cause your vote to maybe not be counted. And I think you're giving people plenty of opportunity to do that and get that done. Scott, I want to take a quick break here and come back. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say just real quick. The other thing is make sure you fill out your ballot correctly. When you got an oval, don't just draw a line. It's important you follow the instructions.
Yeah, and some of us that are quick, I might be one of those. You sort of go through and just put your marks down, do it right, and make your vote count. That's so important. Scott, I'm going to take a
Absolutely.
break here. We're going to come back and talk a little bit about what you do at the Secretary of State office because I get the chance to see your name on a lot of different business type things, but want to
Yeah.
talk about that in depth. Hang with us here. We're on Forward Ever, leading in challenging time.
The most successful investors are those that can keep their emotions in check and take a longer term view at what portfolios will be worth 3 to 5 years down the road. I'd say that's the most important in determining what investor outcomes are. Market corrections will continue in the future. We've seen many of them over the years, only to see equity prices rise higher, and that'll be the case in the future.
Worth Wealth Management, enhancing lives and strengthening families.
Our guest today is Secretary of State Scott Schwab. And Scott, we've been talking about the election, but that's a small part of what your office does. You make sure that's right, but you have other areas. When you go down the list and you meet somebody, say, here's what we do in our office. I have this whole team of people that get things and put things together. What all do you cover at the Secretary of State's office?
That's really a good question, and I really enjoy the question because everybody talks elections, and that really takes up most of our bandwidth when we deal with press, media, and groups and talking to organizations. But most of our employees work in our business division. We have over 20 employees in the business division, whereas we have 5 in the elections division. When you start a business in Kansas, let's say you're going to start a new restaurant downtown Great Bend next to the brewery they got there. First thing you do is you file your LLC with the Secretary of State's office, and that makes you an entity. And that's really important, especially if you're applying for a loan and you want to retain your name. So if you're going to be, Gary's Brew Pub, well, you don't want somebody else coming to Great Bend and calling it Gary's Brew Pub as well. Once you file that LLC, that name is yours. And the advantage of that also is if you're applying for a loan through a bank, it shows that you are in fact an entity, that you're not just making it up. What's also nice about it, what we've done, and we're got to get off an old computer system, but we've passed a law to say those filings are every 2 years because we just want to reduce the administration burden on businesses. And so hopefully by this time next year, everybody will be getting notice that your fee is doubled, but that's because you only have to do it once. You don't have to worry about it for 24 months.
Well, I'm still intrigued about the Gary's Brew Pub thing. That sounds kind of like fun, but we
It's your
actually
plan B.
we actually went through a process just a couple of days ago that we had to set something up, and your name was on that document, on that form, as you go through that to get a bank account, all those other things. So what's the easiest way if somebody has a question? I know your website has a whole bunch of tabs of different things. Is that the best
It
way to
really
access
does.
your
It
office?
really is. So it depends on what you're doing. Granted, we also do notaries, so that would be the best way as well. And we also do documents, whether it's a statute's annotated in the register and some rules and regs. We're the official publishing office for that. And a lot of attorneys already know where to get that stuff because they're the ones more concerned about that. But the best place, because we noticed during the pandemic, we were doing 80 new business filings still a day. That's the low watermark. We normally do about 110. We've been up over 130. And so a lot of folks who lost their job during the pandemic, they're creating their own job. And so we love the entrepreneurial spirit of Kansans. And the best way to start a new business, especially if you're venturing out on your own for the first time, it's ksbiz with a Z .kansas.gov. And that .gov gives us cybersecurity protections that a .com or .org would not give. And we always tell folks, if it doesn't say .gov after it, it did not come from us. So be careful on clicking it and be careful on responding to it. But that is the best way to start a new business. There's a lot of wizards there to help folks create a plan. And there's resources of folks you can talk to about, hey, where do I go for this? Hey, it's a restaurant. Where do I go after this? Well, here's the link to the Department of Ag. Oh, you have a bar in there? Here's a link to revenue. You have employees? Here's labor where you can get your unemployment insurance. Our goal next year is hopefully it'll just be one wizard where if you're starting that Gary's Brew Pub and off Main Street or Broadway in Great Bend, Kansas, you can just fill out the wizard, click send, and all those permits will come to you. We're just not there yet, but we're getting closer.
Now, what about fraud? Just quickly, how do you guys deal with fraud within that?
We,
Is there
you
a way to
know,
report that if you feel something weird? Because you get those emails and they don't have the .gov at the end, and you're going, somebody is scamming me or at least trying to sell me something that I really don't need.
I really appreciate that because there's a lot of snake oil salesmen out there that try to say, hey, you need to go through us for your filing. You got to charge us or your filing is going to be canceled. And it's not much different when they get an email saying, hey, if you don't respond to this email, we are shutting this email address down shortly. You never click on those. If it doesn't come from us and they're talking about your business or your business filing, do not respond to it because the only place in Kansas you have to file to is the state of Kansas. Now, for example, I have an LLC. I pay my accountant to do that. But if I have another business saying, hey, you need to talk to us about your business filing, I'm not going to talk to them. I either talk to my accountant or I talk to the state of Kansas. I'm not going to talk to these third parties. And we do see a lot more fraud attempts on that aspect of things. And we do work with our bankers and our other financial institutions and our attorneys and accountants to give them basic documents they can send to their clients saying, hey, this is a trend. If you see it, don't respond.
Well, Scott, I like where you're going now. If you can just stop those spamming phone calls that we all get, can you do that?
I wish I could, and I wish I could make the line at the renewing your driver's license department shorter as well, but we have limitations.
Well, thanks so much for being with us, Scott. I know the election's coming up. You have a busy few weeks making sure that is correct for Kansas, and I think Kansans as a whole appreciate what happens when you go to the poll, that it's organized, it's well done, and we can trust the results. So thank you and your team for getting that done.
Thank you, Gary, and all those clerks and poll workers out there that are listening to the show. Thank you, because they are the ones that actually pull it off and make everything go smooth.
Our guest today on Forward Ever is Kansas Secretary of State Scott Schwab. And good luck on the election when that all happens. And thank you for all listening to us here. Make sure you get out to vote. You're listening to Forward Ever. I'm Gary Shorman.
Thanks for joining us for Forward Ever, Leading in Challenging Times, presented by Worth Wealth Management. Join us right here next week for another episode with host Gary Shorman. Until then, remember to move forward ever, backward never.